and welcome to this seminar. I'm very happy that today we will present the book by Pamela Ballinger, The War Refugees Made, Decolonization and the Foundation of Postwar Italy, which was published last year. This event is organizing cooperation between the Center for Advanced Studies, Southeast Europe, based in Rijeka, and the ERC project, Unlikely Refuge, Refugees and Citizens in East Central Europe in the 20th Century, which is hosted by the Masaryk Institute and Archive of the Czech Academy of Sciences. Of course, it would have been nicer to meet in person, but however, I'm very happy that this cooperation came up, especially because the book tackles some of the topics which are central in the activities of the both the Center for Advanced Studies and the project Unlikely Refuge. I will list just some of them: refugedom, the question of citizenship, the boundaries of belonging, and of course, the Upper Adriatic area, which I would say that for the first time here, population movements in the Upper Adriatic area are analyzed in the context of a network of relations and migration trajectories connecting Italy also with the Mediterranean area, but to some extent also to the global south. So this presentation will be articulated through a first presentation by Pamela, followed by a dialogue between her and Doina, Anca, Cretu, and me. We are both members of the Unlikely Refuge project. Anca is dealing with a set of questions from humanitarianism to development, refugees, nationalism and national indifference, and the entanglement between social policy, cultural and foreign relations, while I am dealing with the population movements in the Upper Adriatic area and also in the post-Yugoslav area. And I'm also trying to trace entanglements and continuities. After that, we will open the floor for questions. But before moving on with the presentation, I would kindly invite Michal Frankl, who is the PI, the principal investigator of the Unlikely Refuge project, to say a couple of words on the project itself.
Thank you, Francesca, and thank you, Pamela, and Anca also for inviting me to say a few words. It's a real privilege. Also, and thank you for organizing this wonderful event. The Unlikely Refuge project, which is funded by the ERC as a consolidator project, in which I have the honor to lead, is an effort to write a new comparative transnational history of refugeedom in East Central Europe in the 20th century, where East Central Europe encompasses Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, and Yugoslavia, and their successor states in the 1990s. And I'm working on this project with a group of dedicated younger researchers, a lot of them here. It's a very diverse group of historians plus a social anthropologist. And the origins of this project are in my bewilderment some years ago about the difference between how refugees into the Western Europe or Western countries such as the United States and those into the Eastern Europe are being discussed in the historiography, and how these different countries are being measured, against what kind of standards they're being measured. And I started to wonder, how is that possible that that Western liberal democracies are expected to provide asylum for people who are persecuted based on their race or nation or anything else, while there are very few pieces of research that would try to do the same for countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. And there were really very few exceptions. Um, and it became very clear to me that this region is more imagined as a space of emigration, one that is dominated in over the 20th century by violence and becomes a site of multiple ethnic cleansings. Um, it's a space of political oppression leading up to totalitarianism, and of course also a space of economic misery which generates out migration. So this overarching idea that this is a region you leave rather than you escape to is, I think, something which informs how we write its history. Um, it goes all the way to, for instance, the wonderful book by Tarazara, The Great Departure, in which the connection between migration and freedom is discussed in all kinds of ways, but it typically is not the possibility of going eastwards. Um, so in our project, we want to reverse the perspective um, and try to look at East Central Europe exactly because it is a difficult region. After all, today, most refugees in the world are not located in countries that can be called, within any reasonable definition, can be called liberal democracies. Um, so in this sense, East Central Europe is an interesting space to examine. And Francesca already mentioned we're looking at we're creating this comparative perspective by looking at refugees and citizenship, by looking at the humanitarianism. Um, we're trying to analyze it through place and space, and we always pay attention to the agency and voices of refugees as well as their role in co-producing these places, or for instance, co-producing the citizenship. Now, where the narratives about the region in the 20th century are typically characterized by a series of ruptures, we're trying to look at refugeedom across these ruptures, be it, and to look for connections and entanglements, be it across spatial ruptures, divisions such as borders, or political ones, for instance, comparing refugeedom on both sides of the Iron Curtain, um, or across the borders of periodization, thus, for instance, trying to look at what are the connections between the socialist, the refugeedom into state socialism, and the establishment of the refugee regimes in post-communist countries. So to conclude, I hope that the project will feed into a broader discussion about um, refugees, refugeedom that is characterized by expanding and globalizing, and also, I think, decentering this debate. And I hope that this will connect very nicely also to Pamela's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michal. I will add just a couple of words on Michal's research interests, which are the history of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, and as he has already mentioned, he's currently investigating continuities and ruptures in the process of negotiation of refugeedom in the area covered by the project. As you heard, one of the main idea was to make refugees at home in the history of the region, so to write back refugees into history. And now a couple of words on Pamela Ballinger, who is a professor of history and the Fred Caney Chair in the History of Human Rights in the Department of History of the University of Michigan. She holds a degree in anthropology and a joint PhD in anthropology and history. And apart from the book she is presenting today, she's the author of History in Exile, Memory and Identity at the Borders of the Balkans, which has been translated into Italian as La Memoria dell'Esilio. She has published in a wide range of journals, and her areas of expertise include human rights, forced migration, refugees, fascism, sea space, and modern Mediterranean and Balkan history. So, Pamela, please, the floor is yours.
Sorry about that, I had to unmute. Well, thank you so much to Francesca for the very kind invitation, and many thanks to Michal Frankl and Anca Cretu for the involvement of the Unlikely Refuge Project and the co-sponsorship of the event today with the Center for Advanced Studies at Rijeka. It's really a pleasure to talk about my recent book with an audience of scholars who are focused on refugees and displacement and Eastern and Central Europe. Is everything fine for the volume? And okay. So my study examines the worlds of displaced persons in early post-war Italy with a focus on the experience of individuals who came to the Italian peninsula from the territories that Italy lost as a result of fascism's defeat and decolonization. And the book's narrative tracks through the migrations from, and in some cases back to, Italy's former territories. It looks at the question of how to classify such migrants and the forms of assistance to which they were entitled and from whom. The role that debates over the identities of these migrants played in the redefinition of Italian citizenship after the war and after fascism. And finally, once the work of distinguishing citizens from aliens had been completed, the issue of how to integrate those who legally belonged in Italy, but who often appeared to metropolitan Italians as different. That is, those whose social and cultural citizenship remained in question. Now, at its greatest extent in 1940, Italian empire consisted in colonies, so this would have been Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia, which were joined after 1936 together as Africa Orientale Italiana, departments, Libya and the Dodecanese Islands, and protectorates, Albania. Italy lost de facto control over all of these territories between 1941 and 1943, and lost formal de jure sovereignty over them between 1947 and 1960. In the aftermath of World War II, Italy also lost much of the Eastern Adriatic territory, so notably the Eastern Peninsula, Kvarner Islands, Fiume Rijeka, where many of you are today, and the Dalmatian city of Zara or Zadar that it acquired in the wake of World War I. Many of the individuals migrating out of these various territories would eventually be deemed national refugees, in contrast to those designated as international or bona fide refugees, according to the criteria of the then emergent international refugee regime centered on the United Nations. Like Austria and Germany, into the late 1950s, Italy also hosted a large number of foreign displaced persons, rifugiati stranieri. These were primarily Jews transiting through Italy before 1948 to Palestine, white Russians, Bulgarians, Poles, and above all else, Yugoslavs. The border city of Trieste, whose territorial status remained undetermined in practice until 1954, despite its short life as the center of a free territory of Trieste, delimited in the 1947 peace treaty with Italy, became a focal point and a concentrated site at which those populations that would be sorted out as national and international refugees converged. The histories of these various displacements to the Italian peninsula have only recently gained the sustained attention of scholars, though for the most part, the stories told are those of specific groups. So the story of repatriates from Italian East Africa, or the history of the Eastern Julian Dalmatian exodus, or particular groups of foreign displacees, such as Jews or Polish soldiers in exile, rather than being told as a broader history of national refugees in post-war Italy, or as a history that's in deep dialogue with broader experiences of displacement and humanitarian relief during World War II and its aftermath. I should note here too that I'm all too well aware of the distinct and differing historical trajectories and statuses of Italy's so-called redeemed territories, that is the irredentist lands that became integral parts of the Italian state after 1920, and its oltremare, or overseas possessions, as well as the complex questions of autochthony and effective ties to the diverse territories. But that said, the shared experience of military defeat meant that Italian populations in those territories whose sovereignty came into question after 1943 became vulnerable to intimidation and reprisals, particularly in the aftermath of the regime's brutal fascistization policies, I always have trouble with that word, and the violence of the war. Whether in Africa, the Dodecanese Islands, or Istria, individuals identified as Italian through external ascription and or who identified with Italy made difficult choices after 1943 about whether to remain or leave the territory, which usually meant deciding whether to retain Italian citizenship or accept that of the new states within which they resided. This was true everywhere throughout the former possessions, with the possible exception of Albania, where some Italians who tried to leave Hoxha's regime were forcibly prevented from leaving. And in some instances, they or their descendants only were able to leave Albania in the early 1990s after the end of state socialism. In addition, the very different and distinct experiences of departing the former territories, processes that I reconstruct in the book, a process of reconstruction that took many years because of the dispersed and fragmented nature of the archives of decolonization and of migration. These processes nonetheless converged in a shared juridical status as national refugees once individuals had made their way to the Italian peninsula. In addition, some of these national refugees had common experiences living together in refugee camps and even refugee resettlement neighborhoods. So one of my key aims in the book was conceptual. That is, to put together types of migrants that are often kept apart. International and national refugees on the one hand, but also the many different flows of people that constituted national refugees on the other, that is Italian national refugees in this case. The book features several interrelated sets of arguments around questions of Italian decolonization, the reconstruction and reconfiguration of Italy, both in material and legal terms, the categorization of refugees and the periodization of the global refugee, and the consequences of excluding national refugees, which constitute a very particular kind of internally displaced person from the 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugees. So one set of arguments in the book challenges a series of assumptions around Italian decolonization. These are arguments that Italy has and continues to suffer from amnesia about colonialism and its end, or that decolonization barely registered, that is, it was a non-event at the time. But while Italian decolonization is often deemed or even dismissed as precocious and abrupt, but simultaneously non-traumatic, I argue in the book that it actually constituted a long decolonization, considering that it runs from 1941 to 1960, and it fits within the general chronology of European colonial exit. I also detail how the extended negotiations over Italy's various territories mobilized public opinion at key moments, even as the presence of migrants from those former territories altered both the juridical and built environments on the peninsula. In addition to rethinking Italian decolonization in and of itself, I'm also in conversation with scholars like Lucy Mablin, who have pointed out the surprising absence of decolonization histories from many discussions of refugee and asylum law, although this is changing. And she argues that this reflects the presentist bias of refugee studies in general. But I would say also that the relatively belated entry of historians into refugee studies left in place a historically incorrect periodization that treats refugees as becoming a global concern only in the 1960s and after the resolution of Europe's refugee question. This false periodization reinforces what Mablin elaborates as, quote, a myth of difference, setting refugees from the global north apart from those from the global south, with many of the latter coming from former European colonial spaces. And one of the wonderful things about Unlikely Refuge is that it also questions the myth of difference between Eastern and Western Europe in terms of refugee flows and reception. In addition, Mablin contends that the myth of difference, quote, discredits non-Western asylum seekers through a blurring and reinforcing of the boundaries between economic migration and forced migration, end quote. Just as the Italian case I examined blurs boundaries between histories of post-war Europe's refugee question and the global flows of decolonization, many of the Italian returnees, and this word is problematic, but we could talk about it later, were dismissed by observers at the time as not being genuine refugees, but rather voluntary or economic migrants, despite them making decisions about migration in a complex situation of political pressure, and in some instances, forcible expropriations and violence. Another set of arguments in the book focuses on the conceptual and legal boundaries between national and international refugees, a boundary that was porous in the early post-war, but hardened or consolidated by the 1950s. And the book shows this process of making these categories and classifications categorical. And of course, these are categories that continue to shape thinking about migration and displacement today. So in the book, I offer an alternative prehistory to the 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugees by demonstrating how what today appears as a common sense legal distinction between refugees and internally displaced persons, with the former eligible for assistance from intergovernmental agencies like UNHCR, and the latter the responsibility of their own governments, how this distinction was only achieved through painstaking debate over how to classify the millions of people displaced by the Second World War and its aftermath. The vexed question of how to categorize displacees from Italy's lost territories arose repeatedly and preoccupied a wide range of actors, including, among many others, personnel with the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, its successor, the International Refugee Organization, the Italian government, the Vatican, and the British military administrations that temporarily governed former Italian territories in Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia and the Dodecanese Islands. So unpacking the Italian case highlights how laborious was the work at the foundational moment of the international refugee system to exclude from the refugee category individuals such as those coming from the former Italian possessions. And there was nothing preordained about that exclusion. And the exclusion was rooted, I think, in the overwhelming needs of relief and assistance at the war's end, but also in the continuing commitment of many European powers to the colonial order of things. So in just the few minutes that I have left, I just want to outline a few points of connection between my study and the theme of unlikely refuge. First is the issue of unlikely refugees, that is, individuals who eventually were accorded a status as national refugees, that these individuals have remained unlikely or ambiguous refugees, even in scholarly accounts, in which definitions of the displaced do not have to hew to the legal delimitations of the refugee category as defined by the Geneva Convention or the 1967 Protocol, or by various regional juridical regimes of refuginess. As noted earlier, many accounts risk confusing historical reality with the legal categories put forward in the convention, something refugee studies scholars like B.S. Chimney have long cautioned against. Second is the issue of Italy itself as unlikely refuge, drawing here not upon the notion of unlikely as unexpected, that is, the unexpected role played by Central and Eastern Europe in hosting refugees, for example, but in its other meaning as not likely or doubtful. For as I discuss in the book, and as Francesca Rolandi has detailed in her own work, for much of the Cold War, Italy was a place that could and would only serve as a transit point for foreign refugees. In addition, Italy had signed on to the so-called geographic reservation of the 1951 Convention, which essentially meant that it would only host European refugees, and temporarily at that. The growing calls by UNHCR and others for Italy in the 1950s to settle some foreign refugees in light of the problem of the many so-called hard to settle or hardcore refugees on the peninsula and Italy's growing economic boom ran up against the near unanimity of opinion of Italian officials on the impossibility of Italy becoming permanent home for foreign refugees. And the reasons for this, the reasons given were usually the needs created by Italy's own refugees, so the burden of providing for national refugees, and the continuing problems of surplus migration, problems of surplus population, problems of unemployment, outmigration, and so on. We can add to this a citizenship regime rooted in the principle of jus sanguinis that since 1912 has facilitated the reacquisition or retention of citizenship by Italians in the diaspora, and that has made naturalization a difficult and cumbersome process. As Francesca knows much better than I do, there were all kinds of exceptions made during the Cold War period in terms of this issue of foreign asylum seekers and refugees, but they tended to be the exceptions that proved the rule. And I did detail one such case in the small Homeless European Land Program, or Don Murray Project, established in Sardinia in the late 1950s. I talk about this in chapter 5. But all this is to say that Italy did deal with migrants of various sorts in the period following World War II, and this made for distinct juridical and political legacies that have bearing for understanding Italy's transformation from emigrant to immigrant nation in more recent decades. Finally, my last point is that the story I tell in The World Refugees Made also reminds us of some unlikely or unexpected humanitarian actors. Alongside the usual suspects of an early post-war story, so UNRWA, IRO, UNHCR, ICRC, right, the alphabet soup, and the Vatican, though the full story of the Vatican's relief activities remains to be told, we find a very important role played by the British military administrations that temporarily governed the Dodecanese Islands until 1947, Libya until 1950, Somalia until 1950, and Eritrea until 1952. From the Navi Bianche, or white ships, that in 1942 and 1943 evacuated women and children from Italian East Africa to the Italian peninsula through an agreement by the British and Italian government, so the Italian fascist government, with Swiss diplomacy and the aid of the Red Cross, to the role of the British in repatriating Italians after the war, the study challenges us to broaden our scope when we consider humanitarian actors in this time period. As a temporary placeholder power in the former Italian possessions, British administrations had to navigate their own interests, those of the rapidly mutating geopolitical scene, and the humanitarian exigencies created by the collapse of Italian empire. There's also an intriguing and little known story of local committees, such as the Circolo Garibaldi in Albania, that arose to fill gaps in humanitarian relief, particularly in the period right at war's end, in which the Italian post-fascist state remained weak and semi-sovereign at best. So to conclude, I'm very grateful for the invitation today, and also for the opportunity to think about my work in relation to the very productive frame provided by the notion of unlikely refuge. So thank you, and I will turn it over to, I don't know who's going first, Francesca or Anca.
Okay, thank you very much, Pamela, for all the points you have already raised. We will try to explore more in details, at least some of them. I will now pass it over to Anca.
Sorry. Thank you very much. I thanked Francesca before. Thank you again for inviting me. And thank you to Professor Ballinger for such a wonderful book and for having me to comment on it. I would like to preface that I'm not an Italy specialist, so my comments will be very much in the theme zone. I wanted to take 2 minutes first to kind of unpack a little bit the book as I read it and where I think the value is for me, at least. So, of course, the first theme would be refugees. They're front and center. And the theme of refugees has different tentacles, I would say, in the book. But what was of particular value for me was the fact that the monograph shows different ways in which refugees directly and even indirectly shaped international refugee order, as well as national, transnational, and of course, international systems of humanitarianism. And we talk a lot about refugee agency in our own project. And this is very much an example of how that is treated, refugee agency in general. Refugees negotiate status, they actively request and receive refugee assistance. And I think that was something that was very poignant for me in the book. The second theme is, of course, something that is near dear to me, is the theme of humanitarianism. And people who know me, they know I go back to anthropologist Didier Fassin, and I think of politics of solidarity a lot. But what I found particularly interesting in this book is that it's not necessarily the solidarity theme, but also humanitarianism as responsibility. And whether this was British military administration or the Italian state. And this took me to the idea that thinking about post-war Italy, let's say, I think this volume could, and I actually should, be thought in relationship to the literature on responsibility to protect as well. This is usually, this is not a case that comes forward in the historiography, and I think this is responsibility to protect is obviously related more to the 1970s as well as the 1990s. But I think this is an example of how that can, the Italian case can be framed in that direction. And of course, the third theme to me, which was quite prevalent, is a very broad theme of politics, which is ever present in the narrative. But it's not necessarily politics as a bad thing, let's say, but also politics as refugee protection. And the use of politics as refugee protection. A theme that was very important to me was the relationship between sovereignty and weak sovereignty, and the relationship with aid, the calls and reception of aid in relation to sovereignty. And this is a theme that I'm also interested in my own work. So that's why it's quite important for me to see an example of that. I have a couple of questions that Francesca asked me to advance, and I'm going to ask my first question, and I actually went back and forth whether I should ask it because I think it might be a bit too broad and maybe too conceptual, but I would like to reflect a bit on the mobility-immobility dichotomy in the book. Obviously, refugees move, they're on boats, ships, camps are transitory more or less, but to me, the book also talks about immobility a lot. I was wondering if we can talk a bit about, if we can explore Italy's decolonization moment, as well as the Reconstruction period, as one sustained by a regime of immobility. And to extrapolate a bit from this, how did immobility imposed by the Italian state in itself pervade the process of decolonization, as well as maybe the emerging national and international relief mechanisms? That would be my first question. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm very intrigued by your linkage to R2P, the responsibility to protect. And I would be curious also to hear a little bit more about how you're thinking about it in relation to this case. I mean, obviously there were, in the broadest sense, responsibilities for these individuals. And we see in places, for example, like the discussion of the Italians in Albania, and there's kind of this unfolding humanitarian crisis, and the Italian state doesn't have the means to repatriate them, and the UN is saying, well, it's not in our remit, but still we have to at least feed these people, right? There's a basic responsibility for care that somebody has to assume. But I always think of the R2P also in terms of the kind of arguments about armed military, humanitarian interventions and that whole tradition of just war. So I would love to hear more from you about your thinking on that. Secondly, in terms of the sovereignty and the aid, certainly I think I probably focused more in the analysis on the ways in which the Italian state understood and is often, used its weak sovereignty, at least in the first part of the post-war period, one, to sort of disavow responsibility for, say, foreign refugees in order to try to find more resources for national refugees, but then also as the Italian state asserts its sovereignty, it does that through control of refugees and by becoming more assertive in terms of its role, in regulating and monitoring this and taking a census of foreign refugees on the peninsula who kind of predictably are linked with delinquency and so on, right? Kind of common refugee tropes. But I think the question of sovereignty is a really intriguing one here, beyond the kind of typical issue of international law and sovereignty. And I think there's a lot of other things to unpack with sovereignty. And then your question about mobility and immobility. I like that language, regime of immobility, because certainly we can see that at many different levels. One is the fact of just the repatriation process. The Italian state, particularly before the 47 peace treaty, is not eager to have people repatriate back. That's in part because they want to, the Italian state wants to have Italian populations in those territories whose fate is being determined in order to act as a kind of pressure or lobby group. But there's the fear also about the strain of impoverished settlers returning. So there are many efforts to block repatriation from those former territories. And I've written on this in more detail about the Libyan case, where you see this even into the late 1950s. And many of these Italian officials are saying, there's this mass psychosis, that's a term a couple different officials use, a mass psychosis among the settlers that is leading to this kind of pressure for an exodus. And they have these unrealistic expectations about what they're going to find when they come to the Italian peninsula. So, you know, it's this very complicated story of, in terms of the agency of people trying to find ways to repatriate on the one hand, and there's, I think, a brisk trade in, I don't want to say they're forged, let's say highlighted medical certificates, which is one of the primary reasons, if you look at the Libyan documentation for why people were allowed to repatriate after the war, medical conditions was one of the primary reasons. And so, you know, people are really trying to leave and they're pushing up against the immobility of the Italian authorities. But on the other hand, there is this moment where there's the immobility of the British military administrations, and then you have this phenomenon of people illegally or clandestinely migrating back to the former territories. And it's most dramatic in the Libyan case, where these smugglers are taking Italians, especially young people, from Syracuse and Sicily. And then if the boats are apprehended by the British, you know, typically people are deported, which of course is, you know, a very ironic story for today. But the other thing I'll say, I'm sorry, this is kind of long, but in terms of immobility is, I think you're right that we shouldn't sort of overstate that there's a rupture, to use that language, between the fascist and the early post-fascist regime around the mobility of these migrants. Because the fascist regime, of course, it didn't succeed, but it was trying to control mobility in all kinds of ways. It was directing people to colonies and to the internal colonization projects. It was trying to prevent movement, flight from the countryside to the cities and so on. And as I say, getting to the peninsula could be a complicated process, especially from Africa, also the Dodecanese, but from Africa. But then, you know, there's also the attempt to settle these refugees in place. And, you know, I think we shouldn't overstate the kind of freedom of movement in the early post-war period. Although, if you read a chapter like chapter 5 about Fertilia or Sacida, these refugee resettlements, you see that young people, as they had been under the previous regime, are restive, and they are trying to leave these essentially agricultural settlements because they don't want to become farmers or remain farmers, and they're migrating to Milan and Turin and so on. And so it's only, for example, the Sacida, which is near Anzio, the only thing that sustains it is that Palmolive builds a factory next door in 1957, and then people sort of are willing to stay, the young people are willing to stay in place. So it's not that nothing changes from the fascist, there definitely is more mobility, but I think that you're right, especially in those early moments and the kind of management of refugees, and then certainly with foreign refugees. I mean, that's a whole other story about the hard to settle or hardcore refugees who are just languishing in camps because the immigration countries won't take them, right? So, and then UNHCR and others start to push on Italy, like, we need to do something. You know, people have been in these camps for 12 years, 15 years. They don't have prospects, you know, so thank you though.
I think Francesca is asking a question next, right?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. I think that you have already given us an insight into the complexity of this question and also the conceptual issues that it raises that in your case draw on the Italian case, but they could also relate to other case studies. Actually, I will build on some of these points. For those of you who are into the history of refugees or the history of population movements, probably you are familiar with the fact that there has been a call by international historiography to historicize the international refugee regime, as it was shaped by international agencies in the post-war years and also later by the 1951 Convention on Refugees. I will just quote the works by Peter Gatrell, Gerard Daniel Cohen, Silvia Salvatici, and many others. And I think that what Pamela does in this book is to show that also the domestic refugee regime needs to be historicized, and by refugee regime, I mean the set of rules enacted by the government to deal with the refugees. But what is very interesting is that this book also looks at all the practices connected to refugee management and how rules were implemented. I would say the process of including refugees in the national community through citizenship. And what the book shows is that this process was not smooth at all. There is nothing that should be taken for granted. There was no natural bond between the state and its own national refugees, but rather this relationship was constructed in history. And the book argues that in such a chaotic situation as that of post-war Italy, where, as Pamela just said, national and international refugees were often living side by side and sharing the same space, the same refugee camps, the authorities undertook a process of sorting out who was to be regarded as a national refugee and who was to be regarded as a foreign refugee. And tracing this boundary of inclusion or exclusion was not always simple because of many factors, but primarily because of the blurred background of many refugees. And in one of the last seminars with Dominique Rail, we touch upon the issue of national indeterminacy in the post-Habsburg period. And this is a concept that you, Pamela, have already extensively explored in your works on Istria. You focused on individuals illegible according to the classifications imposed from above. So one of the main arguments of this book is that this process of differentiating the refugees affected the way in which citizenship was shaped in post-war Italy, which is, as we know, based on jus sanguinis. And the book also shows how this was additionally complicated by the question of race. And I think this is a really fascinating argument, and it's an example of how classification is able to construct reality, not just the reality of refugees, but also that of the wider society that hosts them. So I was wondering whether we could look comparatively at other countries that underwent a process of redefinition of the boundaries of citizenship after the Second World War. I was thinking, for example, about France or Germany, because both countries experienced massive influx of refugees from the post-colonial space in the French case, or from Eastern Europe in the German case. But I was also thinking about socialist countries, which after the Second World War deprived their citizens abroad, who were those who were deemed as unloyal and didn't want to go back to their country. They were deprived of their citizenship. They were made stateless, and this was certainly a way to exclude them from the national body. So my question would be, is it possible to extend your line of reasoning towards the entire post-1945 Europe, or maybe also beyond Europe?
Sorry about that. We've got to.
Pam, I told you that they're good, right? This is.
No, and it makes me think of a question that actually Dominique asked me, I don't know, maybe a month or two ago, about Yves van Dijk's work, which is sort of thinking about ethnic cleansing, but I mean, we could extend that to sort of the citizenship processes after displacement as a kind of way of rewriting the post-war. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I will admit that while reading in and around comparative cases, not just in terms of citizenship in the post-war, but in terms of the repatriation processes. So I looked quite a bit at, say, the Japanese case, for example, which has interesting parallels as well as critical differences to Italy. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Francesca, but I don't have the have the command of all the details of how one would do that. But I think it's a very interesting project. I mean, and this is the question of kind of scale of projects too. I mean, I tried to bring in some comparative materials to other processes of decolonization and post-war repatriation. But I also at times, really did feel a bit overwhelmed by my material of articulating between the different scales of the national and the international refugee regimes. But I think what you're pointing to is, maybe an interesting thing for another ERC project that would also bring in multiple scholars. This is one of the things I often thought about when I was doing this project, is that maybe I should have done this as a collaborative project, that it would have made my life easier, but also it would have been speedier, trying to tap into those various different kinds of archives and experiences. And I mean, it sounds like that's the beauty of something like the Unlikely Refuge Project, is you've got different scholars bringing these different perspectives and archival and linguistic capacities into the mix. But I think you're pointing to very productive frames for really rewriting the way we think about European history or European post-war history, because as I was listening to Michal talk, I thought, right, I mean, really, this is a really fascinating way through the decentering. And one doesn't think of citizenship maybe as decentered in the same way as refugee history, but the decentering, a way to, for example, rewrite the history of contemporary Central and Eastern Europe, right? And these are all really powerful tools and frames for challenging the kind of historiographical conventions that we're used to. So that's not really an answer, but I think I think it's a great proposal for a work that I'm probably not going to do, but hopefully somebody will take up.
Yeah, thank you. I think you actually did answer, and I'm sure that your book will serve as an inspiration for other scholars.
I hope so. I see Dominique in the chat. I don't know how we wanted to. I'll just leave it to.
I think I have another question. I think we just decided to do two each, but yeah. So I actually had Francesca mentioned the key thing that I had in mind, statelessness, earlier. And you probably get this question. I don't know why. I think you'll get this question a lot about where does statelessness what does it happen with statelessness in this? Not necessarily from a legal standpoint, but also from a practical point of view. I was thinking how, for example, how did international organizations treat some of these refugees as stateless in this context, for example, in which in some cases the Italian government did not accept Italianness of some of these people on the move. And just to bring broader, like I was wondering, how does the Italian case essentially shake, I would say, or shape the narratives of statelessness in the broader history of migration and decolonization, if at all? Yeah, that would be my last question.
You know, this is the question, right? We often associate refugees with statelessness, and then if you're accorded status as a national refugee, you've already been included, or you're in the process of being included in that national community in terms of citizenship, at least legally. And so this is another piece of thinking, well, these also are kind of unusual refugees, but we remember that not all refugees are stateless. But in this case, in the case of the Italian post-war, you did have, and this goes back to something that Francesca said, I mean, you had these undetermined categories. So undetermined, indeterminate Venezia Julians, undetermined Dodecanese. And you know, these were people who, and in this case, both of those populations were regulated through the option in the peace treaty. Not all of the former possessions were part of that citizenship option, but these complicated identities that didn't necessarily satisfy the criteria for the citizenship option in Article 19 of the treaty. And so, you know, many individuals in that moment in the early post-war, they wanted to be considered international refugees and not Italian citizens because they wanted the assistance of the IRO to emigrate abroad. You know, the prospects of Italy in the second half of the 1940s were not that promising, right? Things changed by the 1950s. And so you have a whole range of people who are effectively stateless because their citizenship status through the option is undetermined. Either they didn't opt for Italy, but they're in Italy. And then by the treaty, you are de facto Yugoslav or Greek citizen, but they're saying, no, you know, we don't belong there. We have these reasons for leaving. And then there's this complicated thing to prove that they're not economic migrants, that they don't want, you know, just want to better prospects. So there is this very indeterminate status that's both legal and cultural. And I think that with your bigger question about how does the Italian case, what can it tell us more broadly? I mean, I think that to me is the crux of the issue, or perhaps what's most interesting is the kind of indeterminacy that works on multiple levels. And even then, once people if they have a citizenship, or you know, they are allowed or they remain in Italy, then they are indeterminate still in so many ways socially, right? That they are always lo slavo, l'africano, this kind of offhanded way that the neighbors refer to them, which shows that the process of integration or Italianization, whatever we want to call it, that is supposed to be marked by citizenship, it has not been complete or completed.
Thank you. Yeah, there fluidity and categorical confusions, as you say in the book. These are actually this is the crux of the story. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question and questions, multiple.
Okay, I will now bring the debate back to the Upper Adriatic, since we are virtually in Rijeka. Mm-hmm. And my second question relates to memory. As many of you probably know, in Italian public opinion, but also in historiography, there there has been much stress on the refugees from the Venezia Giulia and the kind of absence of national refugees coming from the Mediterranean space, of course with some exceptions, but basically this is the pattern. And the events which characterize the Upper Adriatic area have become a pillar in the Italian official historical narrative, with the institution of a National Memorial Day, which was yesterday, the 10th of February, which is actually the definition reads like that the day is devoted to the Italian victims of post-war retaliations and the exodus, so the massive departure of the Italian population from the areas allocated to Yugoslavia. And also the complex events which took place at the Italian eastern border. However, there is a huge debate going on, and according to a number of scholars, the way this National Memorial Day has been implemented contributed in building a narrative of Italian victimhood, and failed to acknowledge the sufferance of the other, but also the Italian responsibilities. And also refugees from Venezia Giulia tried to avoid to stress any mutual interest between them and the refugees coming from Italian colonies and protectorates, because they were burdened by a kind of fascist legacy. They were regarded as living proofs of the failure of Italian colonialism. So refugees from Venezia Giulia somehow tried to detach their memory from that of other refugees. And in the conclusion to your book, you stress how refugees from Venezia Giulia were positioned at the top of this hierarchy. And I would add that according to political contingencies, their experience was reframed to construct a memory of exceptionalism, exceptional suffering, which somehow erased the memory of other refugee experiences. And I think that a very important element in this book is that you somehow bring all the refugees back into a context of flows connecting post-war Italy with a wide range of areas with which Italy had cultivated relationships in the previous decades. And you also show that these post-colonial flows were not just one directional. So my question would be, do you see any space for building a different narrative on refugees, drawing on the acknowledgement of this complexity?
Well, thank you, Francesca. I mean, there's a lot of issues in that kind of question of putting the experience of the Eastern Adriatic Aegis refugees together with that of the colonial repatriates. And you probably noted, and others noted, kind of my disclaimer at the beginning, like, I'm very aware, because as I talk about in the book, when I started the project, I really encountered a lot of resistance to this. And I understood where the resistance was coming from my interlocutors, Eastrians and Dalmatians and so on, because they kept saying, our experience was so different, the stress on autochthony, we were an integral part of the Italian state. But I also got it from scholars, and that was part of, it took me a long while to feel that I was actually making a move that was legitimate, conceptually. And as I say, I mean, getting to the Italian peninsula, the experiences are very different, but there are these commonalities as national refugees, even though often in practice, for example, because the flows of Eastern Dalmatians were the most concentrated, right, in these particular moments, and probably the most visible, that often sometimes they preempted the claims of others. So there are moments, for example, when in talking about, referring to Anca's question about immobility, where officials in Libya from IMPS that are still administering these colonial villages after the war, and actually after the end of British military administration, they are holding back people because they're saying the camps are full in Italy. The camps are full with Istrians and Julian. There's no place for you, for those of you coming from Libya. And that's part of what I talk about, the kind of hierarchy of refugeedom in terms of visibility and resources, even though there is a common juridical status, and even something like the Opera per Assistenza Giuliani Dalmati, later is Giuliani Dalmati e Rimpatriati. So it actually encompasses all the groups by the later, I think by 1967, I can't remember the date. But certainly you're right that the memorial circuits are completely separate in Italy. And the memory day, I mean, I think you were present at a webinar I gave in November with the Identity Online project, where I said, is it possible to think about a giorni dei ricordi, not just a giorno del ricordo? And it's very challenging, right? But I'm struck, as I talk about in the book, by the choice of the 10th of February, 1947, the peace treaty date, the diktat, as people often say, that this has somehow become exclusive to Istrian Dalmatian memory, because it renounced Italy's claims over all of the possessions, even though, as I talk about in the book, what was actually going to happen, it took many more years to work that out, and Italy and Italians hoped for things like trusteeships and so on, and that only actually happened in Somalia, that Italy administered a UN trusteeship for a decade. But, you know, I recently gave a presentation, and I had this kind of question from a scholar who is of Istrian origin. And so we had an exchange afterwards, and he said, oh, you know, it's really interesting because I didn't realize that the 47 peace treaty also renounced the claim on the colonies. And he said, I don't think many people in the Istrian Dalmatian Julian context necessarily know that. And so, I mean, one might be just talking about the broader ramifications of the peace treaty, which of course covered all kinds of things, war reparations, and, you know, I mean, it's a comprehensive, if problematic, treaty. But I do think that, as you're saying, there are political stakes to keeping those histories separate, and especially for the Istrians and Julians and Dalmatians as keeping their stories separate from that of colonialism. And I understand not only were the territories different, but of course, the claim of being colonial settlers was used by Tito and Cardell, you know, in the whole territorial dispute, to say these colonials can just go home and the good, loyal, autochthonous Italians can stay. And so there is also a complicated history in the region of that language of colonialism in terms of the territorial dispute. But I think you're absolutely right that there's an exceptionalist narrative. And that also operates in different ways for Italian colonialism. The older literature on Italian colonialism is full of the notion of Italy as an exceptional colonial power in different ways. Often it's the brava gente, they were humane colonizers, but also that decolonization was exceptional. And I mean, obviously every decolonization case is unique, but I try with some of the comparative discussion to actually show that, you know, there's nothing exceptional about Italy's claim to exceptionalism. And I know I'm going on, but I do want to say something about memory. So for those of you who know my earlier work was a study of the contested memories of the Eastern Exodus. And in the new book, I do talk about the memory questions, like at the end with the Giorno del Ricordo, and I have a piece on multi-directional memories in terms of memory of decolonization. But I consciously didn't want the study to be a study primarily of memory, in part because that was what I'd worked on before. And so, I mean, I think there's still so much more work to be done on the question of how these different groups memorialize their experiences in the period from, you know, the early post-war until today, and whether there are linkages or possible linkages. I remember one of the first times that I went to the Association of Libyan Repatriates. I mean, there were people I spoke with there who were very aware of and wanting to connect their history to that of the Eastrian story. Also because there's capital in that. The Eastrian story is much more visible, right? They got a memory day. So, you know, possibly maybe some younger, you know, generations of these groups might begin to get interested. But I think the connections are going to probably be forged first by the scholars. And that's where the interest has come in the refugee crisis of, you know, the last 10 years. That opened up a space for scholars in Italy to begin thinking differently about these flows together. And, you know, the resistance I encountered at the beginning of my project, by the end, I had these young scholars telling me, oh, we have to put these things together. And, you know, I thought, oh, why didn't I publish this? You know, I mean, I had been talking about this out in the wilderness for 10 years, but it was exciting because suddenly there were also, you know, there was a synergy of literature and voices that didn't exist at the beginning of the research. And that made it hard for me. I mean, there wasn't a lot of secondary literature initially for the Italian case and these distinct cases to put together. I know I'm rambling, but I want to say one other thing. So I was thinking about this the other day, thinking about the case of Fertilia, which is this settlement. It was a new fascist new town in Sardinia, and then it was repurposed as a refugee new town. Primarily, I mean, it was for Istrians and Dalmatians, very visible, kind of publicized project with Luce newsreels and so on, right after the peace treaty. But I was thinking about the fact that there were, in the end, other national refugees in Fertilia. I met, you know, a Greek woman, a woman from Rhodes, and the family had, and she was, I mean, I was interested in the citizenship question because I think the family considered itself ethnic Greek. They spoke Greek and Turkish at home and then Italian. They were Orthodox, some converted to Catholicism, and they came to Italy through the 47 option and ended up at Fertilia in 1951. And, you know, the woman said, oh, of course, my daughter grew up speaking Istro Veneto, you know, because all of her classmates and playmates were these esuli. And then she talked about, you know, and then there was the neighbor who came from, these were Italians from Smyrna, and then they had moved to Zadar, to Zara, and then they eventually came to Fertilia. And I started to think about some of the people I'd met there. One woman who was Zaretina, but from Borgo Erizzo, which is actually the Albanian-speaking suburb of Zadar. And so also then this question of what does the Eastrianness or of a place like Fertilia mean? Why have, and there were kind of Eastrianizing processes at work in the social fabric of that. And we think of Fertilia as an Eastrian Dalmatian settlement, but there's all these other stories that are enfolded in that. And even the Eastrian Dalmatian population, of course, I mean, there were lots of different flows between the possessions of the fascist empire, right? So I met an Italo-Somalo who it turned out was half Eastrian, right? So I actually think there's a lot of interesting complexities, but the question is, where is the space, as you say, in the memorial kind of circuit for these complex stories, and they are stories of entanglements, to use Michal's term, right? That of course people were moving throughout this Italian space until the end of the war, and that makes for very complicated personal trajectories and histories, but those are not manifested yet in the official memories. And as you say, there's a lot of political reasons why that's the case. Sorry, that was long.
Thank you, Pamela, also for reminding us of the importance of complexity and the importance of deconstructive narratives of exceptionalism. So we will now open the floor for questions. We will have some 20 minutes because we have to wrap it up by 5 because Pamela has a class later. We will start with the question by Dominique. If anybody else wishes to ask a question, just raise your hand virtually or put the question in the chat box.
I actually just wanted to follow up on all of this great stuff and give you some more things to talk about, which are in your book. But when I read it, I was just so excited because I thought I'll never teach post-war Italy the same again, right? So a lot of how we're talking right now is comparative and thinking about the refugees and statelessness, memory. But another thing when you were saying is maybe I should have done this as a group project. I was thinking about this article that Marco Abram and Luke Grameth wrote together, looking at Monfalcone, those who stayed and those who left, and thinking about ideology, the Cold War, socialism, and defascistization. So, you know, you're talking about what were all the mechanisms that the refugees could be unseen, right? Maybe they're just doing it for economic reasons. But there's also this Cold War, socialism versus capitalism thing that's going on here, in which fascism, the muscles of the mind, 20 years of this is how a state works. This is how the state is supposed to try and remake its world. It's part of your story too, right? I mean, what the refugees do to the state and what the state tries to do to the refugees changes the state. And I'm wondering if you want to talk, and if you don't want to, that's fine, but about what this means about how to understand post-war Italy's defascistization process, its failures, or perhaps maybe it worked a little bit better than we would think if we look at it from the eyes of the refugee making the world.
I mean, that's a great question, and it's a big question, and I'm not sure that I have an answer to how I feel about the larger, epuration or defascistization process in Italy in terms of its success. This is obviously a very vexed question, right? And it does get into all those kinds of categorizations of amnesia, with which I don't agree, both for amnesia about fascism and amnesia about colonialism. It's much more about selective visibility and shifting visibility. But I think the way you phrase that, what the refugees do to the state and what the state does to the refugees. I mean, if we take it in a very particular context, like those of Fratilia and the resettlement projects, I think the processes of reclaiming those spaces and reclaiming the individuals as these, sort of refugee pioneers is always incomplete. And I do think, my first thought, as I say in chapter 5, when I came across these places like Fratilia, was like, oh, well, that's a kind of convenient move by Italian authorities, is you take populations that are visibly identified with fascism and its failure, and then you put them in a place that one is marginal at the time, or liminal, right? Interstitial, like a new town that wasn't completed, Sardinia, an island. And in a way you do sort of visibly displace fascism onto a particular population. And this is something, of course, that the Esuli and the Repatriati always talk about, like we had to bear the cost. But then I started to think that's really, that's too simplistic of a reading, or too facile. But I do think, there are many different purposes at work in the kind of visible resettling of these populations, sometimes in places that are very much, associated with fascism. And whether they successfully defascitize those spaces, I think, is a real is a real question. And then, of course, I mean, there's the use of populations like the Istrians to Italianize the corridor between Monfalcone and Trieste. So I don't know that I want to like give an answer to that, but I will say also that you know, clearly I wanted to write a different history of the post-war, obviously, a decentered one that starts from the point of refugees and asks, what does the post-war look like if we read it through refugee history? And so I could have done this, but I made a conscious decision not to. I didn't want to belabor the point of like going through the very large literature on the Italian post-war, which is often a political history, a history of party, right? There's these sort of key things, 1948 election. I mean, they're there at moments in the book, but I didn't want to write that kind of history. And I decided not to spend my pages like engaging with it defensively, but that was a particular kind of choice. And it may not work for some readers in Italian history, and I'm aware of that. I mean, these are these kinds of methodological and theoretical choices that we make in constructing our arguments in text. Well, I'm glad it works for you. Thank you. I suppose it rests upon an assumption already that someone has that sense of the post-war, but maybe in an article someday I will, you know, talk about that. So, and I think all of you, because decentering is a project of unlikely refuge, I mean, I have a sympathetic audience, but also I think all of you are aware of the challenges that brings too. And I mean, to be honest, sometimes, I mean, I feel that my method is always one of writing from the margins or not writing from the centers. But writing from the margin, the risk is that people think that your work is marginal or that the topics are marginal. No, seriously, I mean, that they're not at the center of the historiographical debates, right? And so I think probably everyone here has to deal with that in some way of, you know, like, how do you make the claim for this kind of historical perspective?
I see that Michal has a question or a comment.
So first of all, thanks for the great presentation and wonderful discussion. And I wanted to pick up one thing that I was just thinking about when I was reading the book and listening to you today, and that I think is very relevant for East Central Europe or what we're doing in the project, and that is your study connects the migrations, basically uses Italy to connect the migration from colonial space or within the context of decolonization, and also the other context which is more familiar to us, that's the context of ethnic conflict, as we see it in the upper Adriatic region, something that the history of East Central Europe is rife with, or was rife with. And this is something, so, you know, combining this thinking in terms of nationality, ethnic conflicts, and mass displacement on the one hand, and colonialism and decolonization, I think is very fruitful. And it's not something that would be accepted, I think, in the histories of be it Czechoslovakia, Austria, we name these states, or simply in terms of the region. So I think going forward, we could ask ourselves how it helps us understand what we see in our countries. And it also led me now in a slightly circuitous way, thinking about the distinction between national and international refugees, which you very productively locate in the post-Second World War situation. And I was just wondering what would happen if we would connect it to the other post-war, to the post-First World War, and the breakup of empires, especially the Habsburg Empire, as in terms of, you know, and then it is a kind of post-colonial situation, and you have refugees from the First World War in all kinds of territories, a lot of them Jewish, and you would have you would have the option treaties and a lot of national refugees. And of course, you would have the first international regime that starts in the 1920s. So I think, thinking very broadly, I think it would be very fruitful to bring those together, these kind of turning points, and see how it unfolds. I would have more questions, but I think I'll leave them for some other time, because so that there's some time left.
Thank you. And I have a response, but were there other questions? Do we just want to gather one or two others, or should I respond to Michal?
Maybe you can respond to Michal, and then we will see if there will be time for other questions.
Yeah, sorry about this teaching thing. You know, it's sorry. It is my day job, but I wish I could stay longer with all of you. It's been really fun. So, I mean, I think absolutely. You know, you're getting at what I was trying to do, is to really use Italy's decolonization story to unsettle some of the kind of conventional frameworks for thinking about displacement, migration from Central and Eastern Europe. And, you know, certainly in the Eastern case, to go back to Francesca's comment, especially when I started studying the question in the early 90s, there was this real exceptionalism that this was a sui generis event. This is something that the participants said themselves, you know, often it was un esito unico and so on. And then in the 1990s, scholars rightfully said, well, no, we actually need to situate the events in Eastern Dalmatia in this broader, you know, post-war unmixing of Central and Eastern Europe. So that was the kind of first move. But one of the things that always, I don't know if it's troubled me, but I thought, you know, one of the things is it leaves in place those notions that your group is challenging of Eastern and Central Europe. They're the places that produce the refugees through violence, and certainly in the memory commemoration sort of complex that Francesca is talking about, there is a real power, you know, a capital from locating the events, you know, the logics of what happened in Eastern Dalmatia in some kind of, you know, Balkan violence, right? That it's if we only stay at situating the events in that kind of regional frame, there is always that risk, not only of foreclosing other understandings, but of kind of replicating this idea that it's the East, you know, East and Central Europe produces the violence that produces these refugees. And you know, it's a complicated thing to try to unpack, but I was hoping that with this, it starts to kind of push at that, to say there's other ways we can conceptualize these population flows. I mean, it needn't be either or. And certainly, you know, the other post-war, I mean, that's a wonderful suggestion. I know Anca is working on this question, right, in terms of refugees. You know, I think the option treaties, minorities treaties, I would just say, I mean, I don't have sort of all the ideas of how one would compare the two post-wars, but I am very much in line with the thinking of people like Jane Cohen and others. I think about her article, The Success of Failure, which really, you know, the beginning of that rethinking about 10, 15 years ago of the League and the first post-war period, that you know, there's many more continuities to the second post-war period. And as she, I think, says that essentially the only way that the ground could have been prepared for the kind of human rights refugee regime that comes after 45 is because of the work that happens after the First World War. So thank you, though, for your comments.
Okay, so I think it's time to thank you, everyone. Thank you, Pamela, for this fascinating talk and debate. To thank Anca for joining us, Michal, for providing an insight into the Unlikely Refuge project, and also trace somehow similarities and elements of comparison. Thank you to everyone who contributed to the discussion. Dominique, thank you. I think that what came up were several topics which are recurrent in the research of many of us. I can see many familiar names. So for example, some words like complexity, fluidity, continuities. I know that are central in many of our research, but also thanks to the Center for Advanced Studies for hosting us, and thanks to Lucia for making the organization possible.
And just thank you everyone for turning out, and I really appreciate it. And I'm very excited to follow the Unlikely Refuge project because it's obviously got resonance far beyond the Europeanist world. I think there's various projects now that are, rethinking the refugee experience from the global South, but Central and Eastern Europe and the second world of socialist states really complicate the thinking about the global South. So I'm really excited to see where your project goes, and I wish all of you luck and look forward to the work that will come out of it. So.